Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, what is applied science fiction? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week we're returning to the topic of science fiction and its key relationship with technological development. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that you can send in your questions for my future guests, either by contacting us on social media, we're at Robot Talk Pod on all the socials, or you can submit questions via our website by going to robottalk.org. So, with all that said, I'm excited to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a fascinating chat with Stephen Oram from Nudge the Future Fiction, all about applied science fiction and the quirks and perils of new technology. Today I'm chatting to Stephen Oram, an author at Nudge the Future Fiction, whose near-future science fiction explores the intersection of messy humans and imperfect technology. Hi Stephen, wonderful to have you on Robot Talk.
Hi Claire, thank you. It's great, really great to be here. I really love your podcast, so I'm especially pleased to be asked. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. So I have so much I want to talk to you about, but to get us started, what inspired you to explore robotics technology in your science fiction writing?
Well, I guess, how could you not really want to include robotics when you're writing about, as I do, sort of near future stuff? I think it's kind of the place for me where, I really like writing about humans and meeting technology and stuff, and it's kind of where that happens in the physical world. It's kind of the most visible manifestation, if you like, of all the technology that's around us all the time, and also a lot of it's highly likely to happen as well. So those sort of things combined together, inspired me, and then also about 8 years ago now, I did a visit to the Bristol Robotics lab, and being shown around there and talking to the people there was really exciting. It was like this massive opportunity, and I think it really broadened my ideas and what I thought about robotics as well. So I think that's had quite a big influence since then as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I came to robotics as an outsider. I don't have any formal training in robotics, and I think I was simultaneously surprised by some of the things that they're doing in robotics that I never even dreamed of, and then also kind of a little bit like, oh, it's not quite as good as some of the science fiction might have suggested, especially some of the more, I guess, far future science fiction that comes up with these fully functional intelligent humanoids that can do everything, and you just think, well, where are they? Well, I think I was promised this.
Yeah, totally. And I think that was something for me on that visit to Bristol Robot Lab was seeing, as you say, kind of seeing the reality. So some of it just being, wow, that's amazing, and then other bits of it being like, oh, really? Is that as far as it's got? And then talking to the guys working on it, and they're sort of like, yeah, well, give us another 10 or 15 years and maybe, and then just absolutely not what the sort of mainstream media or some of the kind of more dramatic sci-fi stuff would have you believe. So yeah, getting that insight into the reality was brilliant and very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. So I've always been interested in science fiction because it's really been quite a powerful force in shaping how we think about future technology, from influencing what scientists choose to research through to, obviously identifying potential ethical issues or problems that need to be addressed. Do you think that this role has become more important as the pace of technological change has accelerated and technology has started to become more woven into our day-to-day lives?
So I think it's different. I don't know if it's more important or I don't think it's less important.
Yeah.
I mean, science fiction is obviously quite a broad term.
Yeah.
You've got the kind of very near future, almost tomorrow stuff, right through to space operas and aliens and all the rest of it. But
Mm.
sort of thinking in the world that I tend to write in, then recently I was asked if I would guest edit Vector, which is the British Sci-Fi Association's critical journal, and they
Okay.
wanted. Well, we came to the conclusion that the issue I was going to do was on futures, which we're looking at the predictive nature of science fiction, the interaction
Mm.
between science and science fiction, all that kind of stuff. And reading all the articles that came in on that, and Nesta did a brilliant thing in about 10 years ago about the mutual influence of science and science fiction. And
Mm.
I think where that took me was that they're kind of mutually influential. It's more of an
Yeah.
ecosystem than a kind of sci-fi comes up with this and
Yeah.
scientists, there's a conversation, if you like, or something like that going on. But I do think, you sort of say, is it become more important? I think it's certainly more embedded, ubiquitous, in a lot of ways more opaque. I think as
Mm.
time goes on, and they're just doing an anthology at the moment, and at the end of that, we've got a ethicist writing, Christina Cardi, writing something. She talks about the code of futures, which I'd not come across before. But the
No.
notion of this, as I understand it, is how likely things are, or how unlikely things are close to you as opposed to far away. So you get this sort of
Mm.
cone, and in that, talking about how at the moment there's so much speed with development and advancement, and so many possibilities that actually in that cone of futures we kind of really don't know, let alone
Yeah.
where things are going to go, but what's going to go, and that kind of stuff. And I think
Mm.
in my mind, it kind of moves science fiction into the role. So I say it's a different role, I think, because I think it moves it into probably less about aspiration, less about getting to the
Mm.
stars or whatever, and much more about a conversation,
Yeah.
and much more about kind of giving that bridge into seeing what may or may not be possible. So I think it's more conversation, as I say, than aspirational, but also I think the conversation we need is a different conversation. Now, I think we've got, I don't want to paint them all with the same brush or say they're the only ones that are doing this, but you've got the tech billionaires, they're kind of leading the discussion.
Mm.
They're even leading the discussion about why we shouldn't be doing what they're doing. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just like bizarre. And there's a lot of misdirection going on there. Look at
Yeah.
the existential risk while we do all this other stuff that's far more dodgy. Don't look over here.
Mm.
There's a lot of hype around all that, bound to be when you've got funding rounds going on and you're
Yeah.
trying to convince people to invest and all the rest of it. So I think for me, I think science fiction can really step in to that place and actually give a kind of a rounded view of what the different possible futures might be. So as I say, I think it's a slightly different role. I don't know whether it's more or less
Mm.
important, but I do think it's different.
Yeah. Feels like there's a shorter turnaround now. Like you can't kind of release a book, wait for some scientists to read it, and then kind of like you actually have to be having that, like you said, be embedded in the process.
Yeah, and I mean, publishing, typically it can be a couple of years to publish something.
Yeah.
So it's really, there's quite a few things I've written that now you look at them not that long after and go, yeah, of course. Like,
Yeah, that's the challenge with near future science fiction, I guess.
yeah,
So along these lines, I guess, as well as writing fiction, you work alongside scientists and technologists to explore some of these future outcomes of their research through the medium of short stories. And your most recent collection, titled "Extracting Humanity," includes stories from some of these projects. So tell me about some of the projects you've worked on, and particularly, I'm interested to hear about the ones that you feel have had the biggest impact on how you view technology.
yeah. I mean, it's quite a difficult question in some ways, because I think every single project in its own way has quite a big impact. You know, they all work differently depending on who's involved, what they're trying to achieve, all the rest of it. And I've been doing it for about 8 years, so there's quite a long list of projects there. So I think it's probably worth just starting off by. So I put it under the banner of applied science fiction.
Yeah.
And just to give you a sense of what I mean by that. So if you think a story has two sort of life cycles, like the first life cycle is its creation, your world building, your character building, you're working out what the story is. If the second life cycle is the telling of it, the interpretation of it, the passing on of it, then where the applied bit comes in is that you get experts, either technical experts, scientific experts, geographical experts, societal, whatever the expertise is, involved both in the world building. So you iterate ideas with them, but then also you involve them in the telling, in the interpretation. So that can be, if it's public communication, then it can be live in events, sharing a panel. It can be on the written page, but basically you're asking them to join in that conversation about what does this mean, or what could this mean for us. So that's where the applied bit comes in.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, I think just to finish off on that, fiction writers, they make up believable, multifaceted worlds. You know, the technology development, the society development, everything needs to be consistent. So you're bringing those experts into thinking about a multitude of developments that would all kind of happen alongside each other. And obviously they bring what's feasible. So that, just to give that kind of view of what these, broadly what these projects are. I mean, I mentioned Bristol Robot Lab. That was the first one I did.
Okay.
It had a big impact, as we sort of talked about earlier, in terms of seeing the reality, being kind of inspired and all the rest of it. I think one of the things I learned from that was the putting of two things together, linking things together that weren't necessarily linked together. So in that particular example, we saw robots being run by urine, and we saw kind of exoskeleton pajamas for old people to help them, or people who had difficulty getting out of bed. I put those two together, and we had a story of an old lady with her piss-powered pajamas. So, but I think the way it affected me was like, okay, this is great. I can, when you're telling a story, you can start to put things together that aren't necessarily together in research terms or development terms. Another project I'm still doing, because it's a 3-year project, it's in its second year, is with King's College London. Okay. And this is looking at whether an AI, let's call it a very general term, whether an AI can be trained to analyse the speech of a mother about their child to predict the future mental health of that child.
Wow.
My job is to write stories that raise the ethical issues. But I think what's been really interesting with that one is I've interviewed and talked with all the clinical psychologists that are on the research team and the AI people. And two things I think that's really struck me about it is when you're thinking about what you might have in the future, you kind of need to put it alongside what you've got now rather than against some perfect idea of what the world is.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the case in that project. And also just, it comes back to what we said about Bristol Robot Lab earlier and other things. It's like how far away this is actually from reality. So it sounds like it might be fairly imminent. The AI researcher, the last time I spoke to them, they was 10 years, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's come out of that, as well as hearing in public what people think about it. Another one that I think that was quite influential, I did something with Coventry University and the Defence Science and Technology Lab. 6 workshops looking very, very broadly and with other sci-fi writers at 50 to 100 years' time, you know, where conflict might happen, what would it be about, that kind of aspect. And that it just brought home how broadly and almost strategically sci-fi writers tend to think, because, as I say, you're creating whole worlds. So you can't just go down one narrow
Yeah.
kind of rabbit hole. Um, I don't know what else. I guess I mean, there's tons.
Well, let me ask you this that's come to
Yeah,
mind as we've been talking. You talked about doing like public events or book readings or panel discussions. I guess you maybe more than the researchers are exposed to, what members of the public think about these technologies, these ideas, but you've also worked closely with the scientists who are developing them. So do you find yourself sort of feeling like you're on the side of the scientists and you want to defend them? Or do you see yourself sitting on the fence in the middle, kind of mediating this conversation? Like, how do you view your position?
it's a really good question, and it's quite a tough. It can be quite a tough place to be,
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I like being in the grey area between kind of utopia, dystopia, the kind of
Mm,
where we all sit. But I think obviously working with the scientists, you get they're people. They've got hopes for the
yeah.
future as well as us, and so I think I do feel a little bit caught in the middle. I think in quite a good way
Mm,
though. And I think the stories also sit in the middle. So with all with all the projects I do on this, the scientists have a veto
okay.
before the story goes public,
Mm,
and it's a kind of veto of that is such a toxic idea. I'm not sitting on a stage with it.
mm.
Um, when we did the Bristol Robot Lab one originally, we came up with the Terminator's not okay, but Black Mirror is.
Right.
So,
Okay.
robot apocalypse, I'm not sitting on the stage
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
that. Something that's kind of maybe a bit dark and pushing things, that's fine because we can talk about it. So I think the trick before you go public is to have those conversations and you're kind of comfortable that I'm not there to kind of push a tech utopian,
Mm,
not the scientists probably aren't either, but equally I'm not there to have a sort of go at the scientists for
yeah.
the sake of it. So, but it can be. I don't know if it's uncomfortable because you've done the prep beforehand.
Yeah. I guess that kind of grey area is not something that is often covered in the media. It's either robots are amazing and they're going to save everything, or robots are awful and they're going to ruin everything, and there's not much in between.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the power of a very short fictional piece is that you can portray, as you said in your introduction, the kind of what's that intersection between the imperfect tech and the messy human,
Yeah, yeah,
because that's kind of where we all live. So
yeah, exactly. So, in your writing, you've explored some of the kind of quirks and perils of technology, and particularly for some of the more vulnerable members of society, from the elderly to disabled people and refugees. Why do you think those are interesting or important topics to address?
yeah, and I think there's probably at least two answers to that question. So, um, an obvious one, I think, is that edge cases, for want of a better phrase, highlight issues that are likely to crop up.
Yeah.
What does it really mean for those people who don't fit into the middle of your bell curve or
Mm,
whatever it is? So they're not standard. They maybe don't have as much voice. They're not heard as much. So they might not be factored in unless it's a bit of technology deliberately for them.
yeah.
They're probably not factored in into the thinking as much as they could be. And then I think also, I mean, it's a very classic saying, isn't it, that if you want to know how civilized a society is, you look at how it treats and
Mm,
includes those people that are on the edges. And so I think that also is important. I think depending who they are, depending what their characteristics are, but they're quite fun to write
mm.
about. And I think, I mean, I sometimes describe myself as being on the fringe of the fringes, and what I mean by that is, I've lived in a way where I've seen the world from the kind of free festival squatting side of stuff, and
Mm,
I've also been a civil servant and seen it from the kind of heart of the bureaucratic government side. And I think having done that, you can kind of see how those two things often don't quite
mm.
understand each other. And I
Yeah.
think that's also probably drives some of uh, why I choose some of the characters I do.
Yeah. I guess it probably as well allows you to tell more interesting, more nuanced stories.
Yeah,
Nobody wants to hear about how the billionaire who lives the perfect life and everything is wonderful. Like that's not necessarily a very interesting story.
yeah, yeah. I think there is an element of entertainment in a good way, and it's interesting and fun to see the world from, as you say, not just from the those that are successful in terms of how society might judge that.
hmm I can't help but think back to your piss powered pajamas, which aside from being wonderfully alliterative, is just quite a sort of attention grabbing, humorous way of pulling together different technologies. I'm assuming that that hasn't come to fruition yet, but have you seen any hints that any of the ideas in your books are now being pursued by researchers?
I don't think that has come to fruition. um, no, I don't think I don't think I can. I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by that. I think so. In extracting humanity, as you said, there's a lot of kind of robotic technology in that, but some of the stuff in stories is coming to fruition. Whether that's whatever that is, autonomous kind of stuff and robotic things. But I don't think that I wouldn't like to claim that that's because I've
Yeah.
because I've kind of influenced anything. I sometimes think I'm a bit of a sort of skimmer and scavenger. I'm kind of taking what's almost, what's possible, what might happen, and just pushing it further. So as much as I'd love to say, I wrote this and they did this. But coming back to your other point about the kind of people on the edges, so to speak, in the piss powered pajamas, I loved writing. It was from the perspective of a really grumpy old lady who disconnected her robot from the central stuff because she didn't like what was happening. It was great fun to write something from that perspective.
Yeah. I think that often gets missed. Like people write about a future where people are all using the technology and they don't necessarily touch on this idea that people might reject it or people might, just not
Yeah.
actually not like it.
Yeah, she didn't like the way that every time it got updated, its personality changed slightly. So she disconnected it.
Yeah, that's quite relatable. So, like science fiction, as we said at the beginning, often features really advanced, really complex robots as main characters. And in a lot of your stories, the robots are often more realistic, maybe a bit more mundane, and often kind of features of the environment the characters are living in. Now, I assume that's partly like a kind of factor of writing near future science fiction rather than far future. But are there other reasons that you've made those kind of choices as a writer?
So I think, I'm a human writing stories for humans. So humans are going to be the biggest feature in the story. That's kind of what I'm interested in. And I think if you're doing that, it's almost inevitable that the technology is going to almost take a background place in that it is just it's part of the world. It's part of the world people live in. So I guess that's inevitable from what I'm trying to do. I also think for me, that's where the interesting stories lie as well, is not in the big sort of dramatic robot that turns up and does all this. Like, how does this look? How does this look for the world? What goes on here? So I think in some ways, I say it's kind of inevitable. I mean, it's partly why I chose the Northampton delivery bot for my photo. I mean, I live in London. We don't have any on-street robots, but you walk around Northampton and these things are just on the pavements, the same as anybody else, and people kind of move around them, or they stop, or they move. It's all very, very natural and normal, but a bit bizarre at the same time. And I think it's that kind of thing that really intrigues me, and therefore it is the mundane that I find more interesting. The daily life the daily life stuff. So I think that's probably the main reason. And I guess also, what does that mean for us and how we perceive robots? Obviously there's robots in medical situations, very kind of specific and obvious situations. But what is that relationship that we're going to develop with robots out and about in the world? And I have been wondering recently whether, if we get to a point where we start to think robots are sentient, even if they're not, but that's how we perceive it, and therefore we're giving some form of agency or some form of something to them. At that point, is it likely that we will then see them as being more flawed because we see them as more human? And just kind of, I don't know, that's something that's intriguing me at the moment. Is like, is it possible that actually, the more human we see them, the more we're prepared to accept that they're flawed, and then exploring that in stories, I think, would be quite an interesting thing. But it's the mundane and the everyday still.
I mean, the mundane everyday stuff is going to have probably much bigger impact on most people's lives than, robots mining on Mars or whatever. But yeah, I think we will be more accepting. I mean, I think I see that already in myself. Like, I've slightly anthropomorphized my robot vacuum cleaner, and that makes me more accepting when he makes, I called him a him. When he makes mistakes, when he bumps into things over and over again, and he hasn't learned that corner is just not good for him. Like, I'm more accepting because I've kind of imbued him with the personality, and it's strange how the human brain works.
Yeah, your expectations are kind of different. Yeah, there's a fine line between frustration about something that's not working properly and kind of accepting. Yeah, but it kind of he's doing
his best.
Doing all right.
Yeah, he's trying. Definitely. Stephen, it's been so lovely chatting to you today. I've been talking to Stephen Oram, an author at Nudge the Future Fiction. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please do share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review to let us know what you think. And make sure you check out our social media channels to see the photo Stephen mentioned of a Starship delivery robot in Northampton, delivering a copy of his new book, Extracting Humanity. We're at Robot Talk Pod on all the socials. Robot Talk will be taking a break next week, but we'll be back in April with more interesting guests and cool robots. When we return, I'll be speaking to Ella Mall from the Bristol Robotics Lab, all about community robotics and the societal impacts of new technological innovation. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.